I guess I'll just get everything started. So hi to everyone joining us, and thank you for attending today. My name is Sarah Fogg, and I'm Head of Communications at the Montreal Holocaust Museum. I'm joined today by my colleague Esther Andor, who is our Oral History and Remembrance Coordinator, and Henry Schaffer, a Holocaust survivor and volunteer speaker at the museum. After World War II, Montreal became home to over 9,000 Holocaust survivors. Of their many diverse contributions to society, one of their most notable was the founding of the Montreal Holocaust Museum in 1979. Today, a remarkable group of Holocaust survivors still speak to visiting groups at the museum. This morning, we have the honor of hearing Henry Schaffer's remarkable story. This special testimony event is organized during Montreal's first ever History Festival. If you're interested in hearing survivor testimony in French, we invite you to join us this afternoon at 1 p.m. to hear testimony from Ellie de Wong. At the end of Henry's testimony, we'll be taking questions from the audience, and we invite you to participate and ask your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. So I won't take up any more of your time, and now it's my honor to present Henry.
Good morning, everybody. As you know, we're all going through this pandemic and so on, and you can only see the upper part of me, but I can assure you that I'm wearing a pair of pants. So I would like to start my story simply by stating that I've written a memoir, which I hope one day will be published in one way or another. I've just gotten word from my my editor that he and I will be getting together sometime later on in the summer, and we'll finish it. It's certainly something that I've already worked on for some time and finished it quite a long time ago, but I need to have it edited. And so I'll just read you just one short paragraph in the first chapter of this story. It's called Memories of a Journey, The Early Years, Chapter 1, Henry Lukasiewicz. So I was born Henry Eckhaus into a prosperous Jewish family in Warsaw, Poland on August the 23rd, 1939, at the worst possible moment in Polish history, 9 days before the Nazi invasion of that country. The world, my family knew the world in which they thrive, was totally destroyed. My father was in London on business when my mother was pregnant. And all the stories that I'm going to tell you, by the way, there's not all that much that I can remember from the day I was born until my about 5 or 6 years old when the war ended. So, you know, my mother was the type of person who would go ahead and never stop talking about her experiences. And I can understand that, but she made me understand that there was a tremendous amount of things that had happened, and she never stopped going ahead. My stepfather, because I was adopted at the age of 7, however, was at the polar opposite. He never spoke about anything and never wanted to go ahead and remember. So this story is about my biological father in London on business. And as you know, if you know world history, Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler had gone ahead and signed a peace treaty at the time. And my father, in leaving London because he wanted to be there at my birth, any expectant father is going to want that, looked upon all those people who were gathered around Trafalgar Square. We had a very fancy hotel and a hotel room, and looked about and thought to himself, God's in his heaven and all is well in the world. This wasn't so. My mother had gone ahead and tried to persuade him to stay in London, but he didn't want to. 9 days after my birth, and actually 1 day after I was circumcised, to mark that special occasion, the German Nazi army invaded Poland, and that was the beginning of the First World War on Friday, September the 1st, 1939. What we suffered in our apartment was absolute devastation. Esther will show you a photograph, first of all, of my parents. Parents, photograph, share screen. Esther went for her. This is a picture of what Warsaw looked like. The building that we were living in was actually, you see, just horrible. These are my parents, my father and my mother. In 1935, both of them originally were not from Warsaw, but they had immigrated there because the possibilities and business opportunities were that much more greater. Also, the social life was far more, there was much more social life. This is an apartment, a building that supposedly the family owned. When this total devastation occurred in Warsaw, the building that we were in, fortunately, was never touched at all. Perhaps, you know, but we saw, my mother tells me, that we saw the smoke and the devastation all around us. So for some miraculous reason, that nothing happened there. You know, I often recount this story and tell the children that I speak to that I was lucky on 3 counts, you know. I mean, I had 3 names. My name was Henry Eckhouse, born. My adopted name is Henry Schaffer, and I've carried that name since the age of 7. But when we escaped the ghetto, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later, we tried to blend in and become as Polish as any other, and my name had been changed, automatically changed the moment that we left, from Henry Eckhouse to Henry Lukasiewicz. And I would say to them, to the kids, more than carrying any name, I carried luck with me because, and I think there are 17 or 18 people who go ahead and give testimony at the Montreal Holocaust Museum, and all of them will tell you the same story, that they survived that horrible time simply because of the fact that they were lucky, and luck played a great part. My father, realizing that it was impossible to survive in Warsaw at that time, or that there would be another wave of bombing, had a car, and my mother, my father, I, his brother Muño, my grandmother, my mother's mother, and our helper, maid, Agnieszka, came with us, and we all piled into the car and joined thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people who were leaving the city scared and afraid of for their trying to get away to some other parts of Poland or any other part of Europe where perhaps they would not be subjected to such horror and such terror. The trip, my parents wanted to go back to Stanislaw. This is their ancestral home. Stanislaw is about 600 kilometers south of Warsaw, as you see it here. And while we were in the car and the roads were never properly marked, some of them were dirt roads. In fact, we always wondered, my mother always wondered how it was that we blundered back into Stanislaw, and we stayed with my father's family home. The decision to travel to Stanislaw was actually a very good one, because in fact, what had happened was that Hitler and Stalin, the leader of the USSR, United Union Soviet Socialist Republic, had gone ahead and made a treaty. And they were going to conquer, they were going to divide all the conquered land. And it so happened that Stanislaw, being in the southern part of Poland, actually it is now part of the Ukraine because borders have been changed. And another thing that one has to know is that in that part of the world, borders were very fluid, you know. One day it was Austria or Germany, and the next day it was the Ukraine, the third day it was Poland. But at the time that I was born, and from what my mother remembers and what she talks about, is that Stanislaw was part of Greater Poland. Until 1941, we had relative peace. The Russians wanted you to become good communists and probably, you know, abide by certain rulings. They were pretty harsh in certain ways. My wife's family suffered inevitably from the Russians, and my stepfather ended up in a gulag somewhere in the northern part of the country. But we stayed there, and were lucky enough to have just enough food to survive, and stayed in my grandparents' home until 1941. In 1941, Hitler, feeling that he had gone ahead and you know, had been so successful in conquering so much of Europe at that point, decided that he was going to invade Russia and broke the treaty. It was called the Malenkov-Ribbentrop Treaty, and that was, all of a sudden the Nazi army invaded Russia. Well, we all know that eventually things turned around, and the Germans suffered immeasurably trying to go ahead and conquer all that territory. But in 1941, in Stanislaw, I just have to look this up because Jews, we were given, overnight, we became under the domain and under the rule of Nazi Germany. The extent of that meant that all Jews were being discriminated against, and Jews were taken into what is called a ghetto. The ghettos were just terrible places. They're probably the worst part of a city that you can possibly imagine. Walls were built around to prevent here's an example of, I'll show you a photograph. There is no photograph of the ghetto in Stanislaw, but there are ghettos almost in every major city in every major city in Europe, where, and here it is, their walls were built up to prevent the inhabitants from going out, and where there would normally be a population of about 1,000 people living very uncomfortably. The Germans would go ahead and make sure that there were 10,000 people living in that very same area. So the devastation and the hunger and the crowding and so created tremendous, tremendous problems. You had disease, people were dying, and there was very little food. Suddenly, there you see an example, a photograph of the Jews who were rounded up and taken into this particular part of the ghetto in Warsaw. And those conditions were no different in Stanislaw. People were dying by the thousands. Typhus, tuberculosis, all kinds of diseases, and food rationing. Food was almost unattainable. Everything was limited with carbs, and it was. But for the Nazis, for the Nazi Germany, and for Hitler, whose dream was to have Europe Jew-free, Judenfrei, he decided that he was going to. That they would have a conference, in that conference, which was called the Wannsee Conference in 1941. It was attended by all the most important leaders of the Nazi Party, Goering, Goebbels, Himmler were there, and they decided that the best way to go ahead and the quickest way to get rid of all the large Jewish population. By the way, there were 25,000 Jews living in Stanislaw at the time. The best way was to go ahead and to change some of the concentration camps that they had around. Some well-known names like Sobibor and Auschwitz and so on, turn them into death camps. And they would go ahead and grab people, put them on trains and bring them to these stations, to Auschwitz as an example, where they were told that they could have a bath or a shower rather. And instead of it being a shower, the doors were closed, and they had Cyclone B gas, which killed them almost instantly. Their bodies were taken and they were burnt in incinerators. Millions, 1.2 million Polish Jews actually died in Auschwitz. In order to expedite these things, the Germans had something called the Aktion. An Aktion was, for them, a celebration of sorts, I suppose, because they would go ahead, and that's when they would go ahead and find the Jews living in those ghettos and ship them off in those trains. The first Aktion, Aktion number 1, was in the spring of 1942. One early morning, We heard trucks outside. Soldiers ran out. The Ukrainian guard, who were in cahoots with the Nazis, joined them and were rushing people out to leave their apartments and get into the trucks, and the trucks would take them to the Stanislawow train station, and from there they would be loaded and taken where we did not know, no one really knew. In rushing through and trying to go ahead and get everybody, on our particular street, when they had Action number 1, they went into apartments number 5, number 7, and number 11. Germans are generally very efficient and so on. For some reason or other, they forgot number 9, and that was the apartment that we lived in. So here is another example of luck, pure absolute luck. We were most of the people who lived there were very despondent about the loss of, or the neighbors having gone ahead and been taken away. But thankful for, anyways, in knowing that they were not part of the group that had been taken away. Summer went through, and then in the fall, in October of that very same year, the Germans had Action number 2. But before that, between that, my mother and my grandmother started to look for work. My father, when we went into the ghetto, my father became part of the Jewish Council, which they call the Judenrat. There were dozens of them and so on, a population of many thousands of Jews who were in the ghetto. And their job essentially was to placate the German masters, but at the same time, they lived with the sword of Damocles over their heads. They could have, they had to adhere to rules. I think my mother told me one story where the commandant of the camp at that time requested from my father a red and white parrot. The likelihood of this going ahead and finding something like that, this must have gone ahead and caused them a tremendous amount of consternation and so on, because I knew that he wouldn't find it. Would be as possible as finding a gazelle on St. Catherine Street today. The leaders, these members of the Jewish Council, were at the very bottom, overlooking the largest population of Jews there. Above them were the Jewish police. So one day, they were taken away on trucks out to some remote area outside of Stanislaw, told to dig holes in the ground, thinking that this was just a working detail. They adhered to their request and started to dig the holes. When the holes were dug, Nazi soldiers came out and mowed them all down, and they all died. There were dozens and dozens of them. It was my mother and my grandmother and I. Agnieszka, who was both Catholic Polish, did not have to go into the ghetto, and she went on somewhere else. But it was the three of us, and the only ones remaining. It was very difficult going ahead and trying to think about how we were going to survive. There was hardly any food available. My mother thought perhaps and my grandmother actually, that they would be able to find some kind of work. So my mother, who spoke German quite fluently, went to one of the Gestapo officers in the ghetto and said to him, look, if there's any kind of a possibility of me going ahead and doing some work, I'd be more than willing to do it. A few days later, he came back and he said, there is work, it's in a factory, it's outside of the ghetto. You'll have to work from 7:30 in the morning until 6 at night. You'll have a half an hour and you'll be paid so much and so much. It will be, actually, the payment was ridiculous. There was nothing there. But my mother thought, you know, here's an opportunity of going ahead and going outside. Perhaps she would find some rotting vegetables or anything, you know, that would go ahead and help me and help my grandmother stay alive. My grandmother was not able to find any kind of work. It was impossible for her to, she didn't have the same sort of command of German or was able to go ahead and find anything for her. So she was left in charge of me and was taking care of me while my mother went off to work. The second action was in October of that same year. This time, we were not as fortunate as the first time. We were rounded up, put on the truck, my grandmother and I, and sent off to the train station. My mother wasn't there because my mother had worked such long hours and was so tired that she and a friend made a pallet on the floor in the factory and stayed there overnight. And they slept in the factory. My grandmother had the foresight, though, knowing that things are not going to go ahead and go very well, decided that she would try and find somebody somehow to be able to go ahead and to save me. And she sewed into an undergarment of hers a large brooch that she still had, or a small brooch actually with a large diamond. And she found a Jewish policeman. The Jewish police were above the Judenrat. By the way, that's my dog. Don't pay attention to her. She's just stretching. So my thoughts were, you know, that it was fortunate that she had gone ahead and done this because she found a young Jewish policeman and was able to bribe him and give him this particular brooch and said, please take my grandson and make sure that he survives and tell him that he's yours and that you don't want him to go with me on the train. She tried going ahead. She tried very desperately to get on the train, these cattle cars that the Nazis had to ship people away. But she was suffering from osteoporosis, which is, of course, as you know, a disease of the haunches and so on, and could hardly move. Every movement was painful. Finally, a soldier who was there in charge, saw her and saw that she wasn't moving and was incapable of going ahead, took up a rifle and shot and killed her right there on the tracks, on the railroad tracks. The Jewish policeman kept me on his shoulders the whole day. In the evening, my mother came home and he, as he had promised, brought me to her. She was devastated at the loss of her mother, but knew then at that moment that there is no way that we would ever survive if we stayed in the ghetto. It was getting more crowded. Food was becoming even more difficult to get. And so she started to make plans and was able to go ahead and find a truck driver who made his rounds around Stanislawow, had a coal truck. And she said that she would meet him at a certain corner. She would meet him at a certain corner, and he would take us away. My grandmother, since my grandmother had died, no one was there to take care of me, and I was maybe 3 years old, or 2.5. So she said, she told the general manager of the factory that nobody was there to take care of me, and that she would take me with her to her work, and that I would sit quietly by her side while she did her work during the day. And that's exactly what happened. She took me to the factory on that particular day, and I sat there quietly, and at 6 o'clock exactly, they had in the factory outside of the ghetto, they had a changing of the guards. And at that very moment, she grabbed me, ran downstairs, we ran out. We had, as every Jew, a Jewish identity, a yellow star. She ripped off the yellow star, and from that moment on, she told me, your name is not what you think it is. Your name is Henry Lukasiewicz. Lukasiewicz actually is as common a name in Poland as Smith or Jones would be in Canada or the United States or England, Australia. The truck driver was a little late. There was a curfew at 8 o'clock, but he came and picked us up, and we were hidden in that coal truck where he drove my mother and I to a city called Lvov, which was 130 kilometers from Stanislaw. My mother was afraid that if she would go into the Stanislaw train station to buy tickets, because we were heading back to Warsaw, that people would recognize her. She was quite well known in the city, and nobody knew her in Lvov, and we bought tickets and went from there. We traveled to Warsaw. She tells me she saw terrible things, and Lublin was a city that we stopped in. Nazi banners in black and red decorated the train station. It was just a horrific sight. There was constant controls of who was coming and going on trains. And so when we came to Warsaw, she found someone that would go ahead and who probably had a Jewish ancestry, who was able to keep us for a while. And after that, my mother and I moved around in Warsaw, in and around the city, for several years. And there was no place ever that we would stay for more than a week or more than a month, because the more familiar one becomes, the more susceptible it is. And the one thing that we knew, or that my mother told me all the time, was that German Nazi soldiers and officers had a very hard time distinguishing who was Jewish, who was not. But Polish people and Ukrainians, anybody who lived in and around Jews certainly would know by the certain mannerisms and behavior and so on who they were. And there was a constant fear, tremendous fear. Every time she and I would, the streetcars were running then, or it started to run in Warsaw again. And every time we would go into a streetcar, she'd be frightened and tell me simply not to make any eye contact, not to look at people, try to blend in as much as possible. About 1945, she met this woman in a small village outside of Warsaw called Outbreak, because the only way that we were able to go ahead and subsist, she wasn't able to go ahead and get a proper card to find a job, was on dealing in the black market. And so I remember her at that time as a young kid, you know, she had this big black bag and she would go ahead and travel to all parts of the country, leaving me alone in apartments or rooms or whatever kind of lodging we would find, and run off to barter cigarettes, pharmaceuticals, alcohol, anything that was portable and that she could go ahead and swap for food. And so that's how we survived. But in 1945 in Outbreak, she met someone, a woman who happened to be someone that she knew from her earliest days in school. They recognized each other, and both of them were going ahead and trying to pass as non-Jews. My mother had found a little house that looked like a gingerbread house somewhere just outside of Warsaw in the forest. It looked like a fairy tale cabin, Grimm's Brothers stories, and perhaps a better description would be something that Walt Disney would go ahead. On the outside, it looked quite nice. I think it had been used by hunters before the war, and it was kind of a shack that they would go ahead and stay in order to go ahead and to recuperate, or whatever one does, I don't know. So this woman had two children. One of them, the boy, was Ira, and a girl of about 5, approximately the same age as me. And she asked them to join us. The moment they did, she didn't know the children, or she didn't see the children at that time. She thought that she had gone ahead and made a mistake, because the boy was 13 years old and his voice was breaking. He was starting to speak in a very hoarse way. He had pimples, a big hook nose. He looked, I think, typically, you know, sort of the image that Nazis had gone ahead and painted of Jews. And so in order to go ahead and have him disguised, and certainly we knew that he was circumcised, she had him dress up as a girl. I knew he wasn't very good looking at that time. I could tell even at 5 that this wasn't exactly my ideal. His name was Ira. We were to call him Irene. She let him grow his hair long. he wore a skirt and was told that if somebody were to approach him, that if he was, you know, not to be mute and pretend that he couldn't speak. I was delighted because, you know, two other kids, I'd been alone all this time, you know, and this was an opportunity of seeing. So I have a very strong memory of this, a particular time where we had known the Germans to be the oppressors and the Germans to be the masters and so on. But from a distance, in that, as we were playing in front of the house in a little blind, we saw a battle, the likes of which we had never seen. There was a man who was running out in front and who had a huge standard, a flag, almost the size of a small house, all red with a sickle on it. And he was chasing there. He was in the front, running behind him, and were hundreds of soldiers with guns. There were tanks and other artillery, and they were running, and they were chasing the Germans because the Germans were running away. And I sensed, and we knew that this would be the end of the war. And that's how the war ended. We became a group of thousands and thousands of refugees who had to go into displacement camps. We reconnected with some cousins, my aunt and my uncle, actually my father's partner, and Sigmund, and we went to the same camp, actually, coincidentally, that my wife's family was in. It was called Bindermichel. It was in Austria, in Linz. And my uncle decided that he absolutely did not like the idea. I think that if he were an American, he probably might have been supporting Republicans. Anyways, he did not like the idea of this displaced persons camp, which is called Bindermichel, where we were. And so he and his two children, my cousin Victor and my cousin Anya and his wife Marisha, my mother and I went, found or were moved to an apartment in Vienna, and we stayed there for 6 months. My stepfather had known that my mother was a widow at the time and had gone ahead and had met her before the war, started to correspond. Eventually, he sent us money and tickets, and my mother and I traveled through Czechoslovakia. It was not the Czech Republic and Slovakia, it was one country, through Berlin. I was so angry at the Germans at the time that I, as a child, I was 6 or 7, picked up a pretend rifle and shot them all dead, I thought. We ended up in Belgium, and we lived there for 5 years. And here I am in Antwerp, Belgium in 1947. This is my mother and I, very, very close, actually, almost opposite, a little room in an apartment where we lived when we first lived. My mother, immediately upon arriving in Antwerp, married my father, my stepfather, whom I call my father. And I would say that one speaks of the formative years of a child being from birth until 5. I think mine were from 5 to 11 after the war. In 1950, my father, this is a factory that he had in Belgium. Some of the workers, there were 50 employees at that time. They were making jewelry and selling it throughout the world, and exporting it to various parts of Europe, the United States, and other parts of the world. In 1950, he went to Brussels with a friend of his who was a lawyer, tried to get Belgian citizenship. It was almost impossible. They said they rejected him, told him to come back, and many years later. So he, coincidentally, the Korean War was breaking out, and my mother was reading the paper and was starting to become very nervous about that. And they decided actually, that they would leave Belgium and try to come to the States. We had 3 countries to choose from: Australia, Canada, and the United States, but there were quotas for the United States. You had to wait and be sponsored. It was difficult. Australia seemed like the end of the world, and nobody really wanted to go to Australia. So we came to Canada, and as Sarah has gone ahead and mentioned, we're one of the 9,000 or so immigrants who came to Montreal at that time. This is me with a little friend on the boat coming across in 1951 on the Empress of France. Here I am in front of the first apartment building. I'm 12 years old, 13. The apartment building that the first flat that we lived in, and it was in Park Extension. And the last picture I'm going to show you, actually, is the picture of my family. No, here they are. As you see, we've grown. There's quite a few of them. My wife and I have 3 daughters, and most of them are here except for one granddaughter who was in Denmark at the time on a study. So this is my story, and you're welcome to ask me any questions if you'd like me to go ahead. I'm more than happy to answer.
If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A that I can see normally, and I'll read them out to Henry, and then he can answer. And so the first question I have is, what inspired you to start sharing your testimony at the museum, Henry?
It's a very good question, actually, because what inspired me was this sort of a sense that there is a great deal of belief, that it's us against them, that it's, one group against another. We don't take human beings as equals. Anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head again. There is racism against anyone who is of a different color, different religion, and so on. So I thought, and it's been many, many years, and I thought perhaps I would be able to go ahead and share this and pass this on, because, I'm 81 years old now. I don't know how many more years I'm going to live, but I would like to be able to contribute in certain ways, and by going ahead and allowing people or young children to understand that we're all human beings and no different one from the other.
Sorry, I was muted. So when did you start sharing the story with your family, with your children?
I'm sorry?
When did you start sharing your story with your family in a family setting with your children?
I don't want to say anything about my family, but they're very boisterous and so on. And a lot of them, my voice is rather weak. I've had occasions to go ahead and say and talk to them individually, but I tried certainly when they were younger to try to share, my experiences and so on. But I've been telling them for the last number of years that I'm writing something, and I think they would probably be more comfortable in reading it, and and that's the reason that I was inspired, by the way, to share this story is through my writing.
There's another question. That goes back to your grandmother, was there ever a sense of wanting to retrieve her body from the train station, knowing that, of course, it was difficult or almost impossible, but did your mother ever speak about trying to do something about that?
My mother was quite distraught when she found out about her mother, because she loved her and described her to me in very in a language stating that she was lovely, she was beautiful, she was strong. However, the less I had to do with going back to Poland or having to do, when I came here, I had a very strong desire to be Canadian, to live a life here. And I did not want at all to have anything to do with what was going on in Poland. I sensed, even after the war, especially after the war and many years later and so on, that there was still this kind of anti-Semitism, and I wanted to get away from it. I know that my grandmother was probably buried with many others, because at the time, and there was probably no demarcation, so it would be impossible. It would be some very important, heroic gesture to find. It would require huge sums of money to dig up all of that and to find her bones, DNA and all that. Who knows?
Were you ever hurt or beaten by Poles or Germans in your youth?
I was lucky enough never to have felt physically hurt in any way. There was only this palpable feeling of fear and idea of trying to hide, and something that was instilled in me, and that my mother, when I had it, talked about a great deal. But no, I didn't.
Then another question, did you keep in touch with the family that you lived with in Otwock? What happened to Ira and his mother and sister?
No, I don't know what happened to them. They only came into my consciousness when I was well into my 70s. I don't think I thought, oops. I don't think I ever thought about them. my greatest concern was for my immediate family and the family that I had in Holland. And I stayed in touch with that family and the family, and my mother's brother who was in the Soviet Union in a gulag, and eventually in Israel, and then from Israel came to New York and lived in New York. And I have two cousins who live in New Jersey. One of them works for the FBI.
Another question, how have you found the strength to become such a peaceful and loving person after all you have gone through?
That's an interesting question, actually. It goes to my, it goes to my nature. I don't think that I've changed in any way. I've become the person I am and have been all this time, and I don't think that it requires any special consideration.
Another question, how long have you had your parents here with you in Montreal?
My stepfather, whom I called my father because I knew him from the age of 7 on, died in 1981 of throat cancer. He developed old cell carcinoma and so on. My mother lived to a ripe old age of 97, and I was lucky enough to have spent a great deal of time with
her. Another question, how did you manage to have such a great sense of humor?
I'm sorry?
How do you manage to have such a great sense of humor?
If you think I'm funny, wait till I do my comedy routine, you know. I do a stand-up.
Somebody is asking what your dog is called.
Okay.
Henry.
My dog is her name is Belle, and she's the belle of the ball here. B-E-L-L-E, Belle. Actually, she's female. We had when we were younger, my wife and I had a dog, a male dog, also wire-haired dachshund, normal size. His name was Bo. So I figured Bo, Belle, there we go.
I think we got to the end of our questions. So if there's no more questions, I would like to thank everybody who came and listened to Henry's story. I would like to thank Henry for sharing with us his story. And if anybody's interested in a French testimony in the afternoon, as my colleague said, we have Elida Wang, survivor from France, who's going to speak at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.